Hey everyone, this is number 2 in my render forecasting series. The last video that we covered projections. Now we're going to talk about actuals. I include the actual spreadsheets that you're going to be able to download and use yourself. So let's jump in it right now on A Cup of Joe. All right, I probably wasn't totally clear there. So if you haven't watched video 1, then you want to go back to this link right here and watch the first video. Then come back and watch this much shorter second video. Otherwise, it may not make sense to you. All right, let's go back. Hey subscribers, have you ever shared one of my videos on social media or LinkedIn? Try it, see how it feels. In my previous video, we went through projections. We went through some detailed spreadsheets, including these worksheets such as staffing, farm size. We went through the show page, which is where we go through and assign how big is the show going to be. We went through and talked about top-down projections and bottom-up projections. But now we're going to talk a little bit more about the show projection form. And if you'll notice, a little change from the last one to this one is another row towards the bottom called actuals. What actuals are usually is an export of a database that's tracking all the renders. You heard me mention that in the last video, that you want to have some database collecting all the renders. I could do hours of videos just about how to do that, and it's very complicated, but you do want to have your database administrator or someone in your studio figure out how to take the core hours that are being collected in your render queuing system and have those exported and moved to a render database that allows you to look at all the shots that have run in a particular period of time. That's why we call it a time series database, and allows you to do queries for a particular week, month, a particular show, sometimes a particular artist. And in this case, in most of the studios I've been in recently, we'll do a query for how many core hours ran in a particular week. And in this particular export, we put it for the show. So for this show, what we're calling show 1, you have your top-down projections in here. You've got your bottom-up projections in here. Remember, we talked about doing those detailed projections. And now we have the actuals. Now, this is what actually rendered in this theoretical model. So again, you would get an export. Sometimes it's just a SQL query. Sometimes it comes from an ELK stack, which is Elasticsearch, Logstash, and Kibana. That's, again, a whole other video to discuss. But needless to say, you need to be able to get those core hours into a document. Without being able to do that, it's very hard to record actuals. So let's assume you have that capability. Let's assume you've developed that capability and your studio supported that ability. So now what you need to do is look at all those projections you made and say, how much are we actually using? This process is very similar to when you have a utility that maybe takes the money straight out of your bank. Well, you're going to project how much you expect that utility to cost every month, but you want to look to see how much it actually costs, right? If those numbers are going up, then you're going to need to use less of the utility or start to expect to spend more in the future. One of the two things is going to have to happen, and we do the same thing with the render farm. We're going to look at our projections and say, are we matching our projections? Are we coming in short? Are we coming in over? By punching in these numbers, you're now going to be able to compare those. And let's go ahead and jump straight to the show graph. So this is the show graph. I showed it to you before. It had 3 dotted lines on it, each representing 3 projections. They had the top-down projection, the bottom-up projection, and then the detailed projection, which was created a little bit later by the show themselves. Now, you'll look at these green line. This is the actuals. I just showed you those numbers we punched in. These are the ones we got from the database. This is how the actual usage has been going with this show. And as you can see, if you dive in there and look at the early months, you'll see that at the beginning, it actually was using a little less than we had projected, but then it started to use a little more. This is not uncommon. If you don't render earlier on, you're likely going to render a little more later on. And you'll notice that they were blowing right over those historical top-down and bottom-up projections we did, but they're coming in much closer to the detailed projection that the show did a little later. I keep pointing out on that cone of uncertainty that the closer you are to now, the more accurate the projection is going to be. So most often when I would get a fresh projection from a show, the weeks that were coming up closely matched the weeks that just happened before that. Makes sense, they would line up. I would take this graph to the meetings every week or two with the shows, or at least get them these reports in their email box and flag whenever I would see that green line going over their projections. That was a huge problem. That meant that we were basically not necessarily using what they had projected, and if this is going to keep up, we're going to need to increase their projections or reduce their usage. Also, if it comes in really, really low, that's also a concern because you're wondering why you projected all this usage, but you're not using it. So whenever you see their usage is below what they projected, that's something not to celebrate. That's something to be concerned about because whatever they're not rendering now, they're going to need to render later. And so again, you might want to think about increasing those projections. If we zoom in on the graph, you can see a little better detail about how you can track week to week how you're doing relative to the various projections. Again, at the end of shows, I've often had 8, 10 different projections lined up on these type of documents. And it's a real great way to track how the progress of the show is going and apply that knowledge to the next show you're doing. Now let's jump to the studio projection document. This is where we take all of the shows and put them in to see whether or not we're going to have enough procs or not for those particular shows. You'll remember I pointed out before that we're currently projecting to need more render than we have in capacity. This is not an uncommon problem at studios. And so I left it on this graph because that's approaching, and that's something I would always flag to upper management and to the show producers that this problem still hasn't been solved. But now let's take a look at the actuals. So this looks just like the projection document. It's a carbon copy, only we're putting here what actually occurred. And now we can take this bottom line of how many core hours we used and overlay it over that same graph I showed you before. Remember I showed you the studio graph. This showed all of the show projections, their latest projection from each show stacked on top of each other, and it would project how many core hours we're going to need. Again, you can see later on, towards the end of the year, we're going to have a major deficit. But more importantly, you can see that in totality, all of the shows are using more of their projection. And when you add them all up, you can see that now the actuals are running well over what they projected. Again, this is a problem. This means that these projections coming in from the shows are not accurate. And each projection for each show needs to be broken out into its own analysis, like I showed you on the show graph. We need to do that for each of these shows and go back to each of these shows and talk to them about why is it that they are using more than they expected. Is that going to continue? Do we need to increase the projection to account for that? Or do we need to work on some efficiency to bring that number back down? You want to look at this every week. The longer you wait, the longer this gap grows and you don't address it, the harder it is to get it back into congruence with the projection. If you think about all the steps that are involved in here, which is changing projections for each show, running them through multiple iterations, looking at how the actual renders are happening and whether or not those can be trimmed, making these changes, reducing the usage or increasing the projections is a slow moving boat. So just like a tugboat moving a big oil tanker, it takes a while to move it to one direction or to another. And so you need to always be plugging away like a tugboat at this problem so that you can slowly get these numbers where you need them. If you keep approaching that red line and the projections are not coming down, you've got to pull the fire alarm with upper management and senior management and even the executives saying we don't have enough farm. It's important that you say this. And in many studios, you may say this, everybody may look at you right in the eyes and say we know, and you still don't get any farm because there are simple dollar realities sometimes. Sometimes the budgets simply don't allow for more farm. And what that usually means is that the artists are going to feel the squeeze. The render wranglers are certainly going to feel the squeeze. And as the shows get closer to their deadlines, they're going to be screaming about how they're not getting things done properly. They're going to have to do less iterations, and the product will effectively decline in quality because they're doing less iterations in a more rushed fashion. So it's really, really important if you're working on these documents that whenever the results don't look good, you scream and yell about them. And because you're looking at this data every week and going over it with the shows, you're able to show back up to upper management how you've adjusted to the problem, how you've perhaps gotten more efficient with the renders, perhaps you've changed the schedule of the show. You can show them very iteratively and very minutely how you're trying to do everything you can to avert the problem. Sometimes they simply need to have more procs. Sometimes the directors really throw you a curveball. Sometimes one of these big comic book movies just keeps getting thrown back from final to unfinal over and over and over again, and it just is unanticipated that this extra rendering is going to happen. Whatever it is, it needs to be accounted for, it needs to be reconciled, and it needs to be put in this document so you can account for it. Although I didn't include the worksheet with this template, you can simply take this projection document, make a copy of it, and start tracking month for month how many artists did we have, how big was our farm. And at the end of a show, it's really important to make a score sheet on how, if you're not tracking projections and actuals in a database, then it's very important you track this. At the end of a show, you want to take a look at What were the total number of shots? What were the total number of frames delivered to client? And then how many machines, or if you can, how many core hours did it take to get there? You'll also be talking about how much disk space it takes to get there, but that's going to be a video that I do after the next one where we talk about disk space projections. But this is mainly going to be measured by artist angst and feedback. In other words, if the artists have been constantly screaming in production that they simply don't have enough procs, then you're going to need to increase that per artist number for future shows. This is something that's a lot more about a discussion between producers and sometimes even recruiting and human resources as to how many machines and how starved do the artists feel. Again, this document will not help you project super accurately, but at least it gives you a baseline that you can know that you need to increase a certain amount of machines, or you can even feel free to decrease a few amount of machines if really you're not hearing any complaints from everybody. It doesn't quite have the black and white actuals that the other ones have because you're not gathering data in a per core hour, per machine, per shot basis. But you do want to reflect back upon this document and constantly be asking yourself, should I be increasing the number of machines or number of cores that I'm allocating per artist? It's the actuals on this one is just simply a lot of subjectivity is what it comes down to. So, that's about it. That's why I think this document, this staffing projection, is something that's really helpful to augment your render projections, to give you another view on your render projections, and to make sure that even if the show isn't expecting to quite ramp up, that your artists that you're going to have on site have a farm to use in the interim. It's a very important document to have. But in the absence of having any of those render stats, you come into a studio and there's no history of any render core hours whatsoever, well, then this document becomes very, very valuable. I really hope this helped. This is, again, a very similar document to the last document I did in the first video. This simply has the actuals folded into it. So if you're going to grab a document and really use it, I would recommend you use this document versus the last one. They're almost perfectly the same except for the actuals being added in. So if you've already started on the old document, don't worry about it. You can just add the actuals manually. Like I said, you're going to need to know Excel to work these documents. It's not rocket science, but you need to know Excel a little bit. There's a lot of tutorials and ways to learn out there. And if you feel like you're stuck on Excel and you're not sure where to turn, reach out to me. I'll point you in the right direction. And that wraps up Actuals, the second of the 3 series. Stay tuned for my third video in this series of 3, where I'm going to talk more specifically about render strategies, the render efficiency curves, how to deal with frame counts and scheduling, and how to erect fences on the farm and the pluses and minuses of that. So what I mean by that is farm partitioning. So we'll be talking about that in our third video, and I'll have a few spreadsheets to include with that one as well. So feel free to download the spreadsheets. Hopefully you like number 3. Feel free to comment or send me an email to cupofjoevfx@gmail.com. I'd love to hear from you, and if you have questions about this, I'm willing to answer them. Thanks, everyone.